Hello again, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the participles of English. Now, in English, you are going to be faced with different grammatical constructions, and most of them do require participles. So it will benefit us to look at them in some pretty significant detail. There are two main participles. Well, there are only two participles in English. We have the first participle, or the present participle, the ing form, and the second participle, or the past participle. Now, there are two examples on your screen at the moment. For example, watching or reading. These are both in the present participle, and watched and read. These are in the past participle with the ed ending. So the participle is the form of a verb which can have different functions in a sentence. And let's examine them now a little bit more closely. So if we're looking at the present participle, some of these forms probably look very familiar to you. That's because you've been using them for a while. For example, we use the present participle, or again, the ing form, to form the continuous tense. For example, I'm talking to you right now. Or as an adjective, dancing, shouting, smiling. Or also as adverbs, she was sitting in her armchair thinking, talking about how she was sitting. And finally, as a gerund, I insist on doing it. Now, the first participle, or the present participle, has some tense distinctions. It can be either active or passive, as well as simple or perfect. And both of them can be used in active or passive with transitive verbs. And you have to remember that transitive verbs are verbs which have an object after them. For example, to do tasks, or to do certain sports, or to cook food, like baking a pie, sending a letter. So, the first participle, in its active voice, and with the present participle in the simple, would be writing. In passive, it would be being written. We know from the passive voice to be written in the participle form, it's just being written. To make it perfect, just like in the normal perfect tense, we would say have, having written, and in the passive voice, again, having been written. So this should look very familiar to you. The present participle is used to describe verbs. For example, they walked laughing along the street. Here, laughing explains to me how they were walking at that time. We also use the present participle after verbs of sense. For example, see, hear, smell, feel, to express the continuation of the action, which happens simultaneously with the action expressed by the predicative. Now, this will make a little bit more sense when we look at the example. They watched her dancing. Here, I am explaining what they watched her doing. Now, to be more fluent, or to speak more fluently, we can also combine two separate sentences with a participle clause. And let's look at this with a few examples. In the first example, we have two sentences. Jenny learned the new words. She wrote an essay in English. But we can combine them like this. Having learned the new words, she wrote an essay in English. Another example, Jenny was reading a funny book. She couldn't help laughing. We can combine these as, while reading a funny book, Jenny couldn't help laughing. So when the verb in the main sentence and in the participle refer to the same subject, we can combine the sentences by using a participle clause. This also shows a greater relationship between the two topics. Now let's look at a couple more examples. Looking at her child, she forgot about everything else in the world. Or, reading an English book in the original text, I usually write out some interesting phrases. Now, these are participle clauses where the first participle indefinite active is used. Now, examining these sentences, we can conclude that the action expressed in the present participle is simultaneous with the action expressed in the predicative. But if the action in the participle phrase does not happen at the same time, we should form the sentence in a different way. So let's look at a couple more examples to see how we should do this. They discussed the candidate who made a great impression on them during the meeting. Or, I want to talk to the person who painted this picture. Or finally, please call the woman who came to our place yesterday. Here, we're not using the present participle. Here we have to use the past participle, but we'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But now look at the following sentences. Having looked at the photo, he remembered to call his mom. Or, having read the book, I decided to watch the film. These sentences are using the active form of the present participle. And with verbs of perception or motion, we can still use the first participle indefinite even if the emphasis is the same. For example, hearing the footsteps downstairs, she felt frightened. I can still use the present participle to make this sentence. So now let's move to talking about the past participle or the second participle. Now, in school, you must have learned this as the third form of the word, or that third column where any irregular verbs showed up. For example, speak, spoke, or spoken. Here, the third form, spoken. Or teach, taught, taught, write, wrote, written. Here, we have the third form. This is the past participle. Now, for some words, it will just be an ed ending, or you will just simply need to add the ed ending to the word in question. For example, decide, decided. So for some words, the past participle is simply the same as the past tense form of the verb. However, for any irregular verbs, the past participle will be different, and you do need to memorize it. And finally, we use the past participle to form the adjective from some verbs. For example, confused, bored, exhausted. However, there's one difference here between the past participle and the present participle. And that is that the past participle cannot be used to form an adverb. Only the present participle can do that. So there's also another difference, and that is that the past participle does not have an active form. It is only ever passive. So let's examine the past participle and how we use it in some sentences. One way that we use the past participle is as a predicative. For example, when he arrived home, the door had been opened. Here, it just tells me about what happened to the door in the past. The door had been opened. We can also use the past participle as an attribute. Like in the phrase, they talked to each other through the locked door. Here, locked is simply an adjective describing the door, but we're using the past participle of the verb to make it. We also use the past participle whenever we're forming complex object. For example, they saw the door being broken. Here, I'm explaining what was happening to the door when they were looking at it. I'm explaining to you what they saw. And finally, we can use it as an adverbial modifier of time. For example, in a comparison, their tricks, if they were discovered, would bring them a lot of troubles. Here, their tricks, if they were discovered, I'm creating an hypothetical time phrase. I'm using an unreal conditional, and I use the past participle to do this. Now, quite often, students feel confused about which participle to use, particularly when we're forming the adjective forms of words. So let's analyze the differences between a few of these phrases in their present and past participle forms. For example, if we look at the phrase boring, like in the sentence, he couldn't stand reading that boring book, or the word bored. He had a bored look on his face. So what's the difference between these? The ing ending is used to describe somebody or something that causes a reaction, whereas the ed ending is used to describe something or somebody who experiences that reaction. They themselves feel this emotion. Now, the simplest way to think about this is using the words bored and boring. Someone can be boring, but to other people, not to themselves. But if I am bored, it is I myself who am bored by somebody else or something else. Now let's look at a few more examples using this comparison. Amusing, like in the phrase, there were a lot of amusing illustrations in the book, or amused. The child felt amused by the funny stories Mom was telling him. Again, here, in the first sentence, the illustrations, the pictures are amusing to the subject, or to whomever we're talking about. But in the second sentence, the subject himself or herself is amused. It is their state at the time, and they are amused by something, by an actor, or just by, in this case, the stories. Let's look at another. Confusing. Like in the sentence, grammar seems to be confusing sometimes. Or confused. I felt really confused by the direct question. So here, again, in the first sentence, grammar is confusing to me. But I am confused. One more. Let's look at satisfying. For example, his test results were satisfying, or satisfied. Like in the sentence, people I work with are satisfied with their work. Again, it's the same relationship. What about tiring and tired? For example, in the sentences, working late every day is too tiring. Or, having walked for 2 hours, they felt completely tired. Here, again, I'm describing working too hard, and I'm saying that it is tiring. I think it is tiring. But if I say that after walking for 2 hours, I am tired, or we are tired, or they are tired, we're talking about experiences that we, they, or I am having. Also, frightening versus frightened. For example, in the sentences, he liked listening to frightening stories. Here, he's describing the stories. Or the boy was frightened to death by the dog. Here, it's the boy that is frightened, the subject. Now, the words exciting and excited. For example, I have never read a more exciting book. Here, I am describing my thoughts about the book. Or, she felt excited to receive such a present. Here, she is describing, or rather, I am describing her feelings about the present. The next words, surprising and surprised. For example, we got a rather surprising result from our experiment. Here, describing the result. Or, I'm really surprised to meet you here. Describing myself, I am surprised. Or what about embarrassing or embarrassed? Here, an embarrassing thought occurred to her to call somebody for help. Now, be careful. Even though embarrassing is at the beginning of the sentence, it's still describing the thought. It's not describing her state, it's describing the thought. Whereas in the sentence, she felt embarrassed at the wedding, is describing her feelings, what she herself experiences. And finally, annoying versus annoyed. Like in the examples, she couldn't stand that annoying noise any longer, and she felt annoyed by the loud music. So, in conclusion, the participle is simply a non-finite verb which has a verbal form, an adverbial form, or an adjective form. Now, I'm sure that after you review all of this a couple times, that none of it will be too difficult. So be sure to look over all of the tables and review this lesson once or twice, just to make sure that you've really got it down. I'll see you in the next lesson.